It's always nice to start these episodes on a morning, so let's begin a short way after sunrise in July. And on a morning where I'd impulsively decided to set a 4:30 a.m. alarm and drive to St Michael's Mount just cause, that's a story for another time, on the way there I did stop off here, and after a short, sharp hill climb from the car park, glorious. And while it has functionally nothing to do with the archaeology, just the manner that the site has been mowed just feels like a little treat for us aerial photography enthusiasts. Lush. So the publications like Historic England and Hillfort Atlas are puzzlingly quiet on this one. I was coming up a little short on reliable info, other than mentioning the interned entrance to the east and likely one to the west, seen covered by trees here. Its setting in the landscape seems to more than justify the use of the site. The slopes sharply falling off to the River Linher in the valley below. The ditches are at an impressive height, but other than that, there's not a lot of info I could pull up on this. And you'll see this becomes something of a trend. I had been looking forward to this for a long time. When it comes to ancient sites in Cornwall, we really are getting into luxury mode as we get further west. Not only does it have this unbelievable concentration of Neolithic monuments, but when it comes to the Iron Age, we're going to see some of the most remarkable sites, quite unlike anything we've seen in southern Britain so far. So much so that please consider this a two-parter. There's of course a large number of hillforts to explore as well, but for now we're in eastern Cornwall, and a short way away, but a completely different day, when I got to Padbury Top, there was a storm blowing in from the west, and wind always looked far less severe on camera. I could leave the onboard mic in on the audio mix to drive the point home, but if you can see it this clearly in the footage, it is at least 5 times worse than it looks. In fact, my attempts to get aerial footage nearly resulted in my Mavic Mini beginning a new life without me, probably about 20 miles to the south and out over the sea. So I limited my shots to just a few feet off the ground. Not the greatest view, but the only option that would allow me to keep my Mavic for another day. It's a small enclosure with pretty impressive banks, a well-formed circle, but the entrance to the east makes it ever so slightly teardrop-shaped. This is in fact the surviving bank of what may have been up to 4. I can only really make out the second on the LiDAR, which is now mainly visible as a counterscarp to the main bank. It's not hard to see why this rise was chosen, given the superior views you get to the south and east. As I'm obliged to say somewhere near the top of all of these episodes, this is far from a complete list. However, if the selection we get through in these next 2 episodes is not to your liking, please remember that it's going on top of a pile of nearly 120 sites that we've already covered in this series, and we're not even at the halfway mark yet. Okay, we're maybe close to the halfway mark. Anyway, please do go back through those episodes because they not only give context, but also answer a lot of the questions you might have about hillforts and the Iron Age in general. The next 2 are brilliant, though I'm just annoyed I didn't get more footage. This was quite a long time ago. We took a Cornwall trip in February 2022. We got some pretty great weather considering, and rather stupidly, I got a couple of good angles on these, but then nowhere near enough shot variety. Well, firstly, buried down. On the day, I was focusing on the much more obvious enclosure at the centre, but we were fortunate that with the light on this winter's day, you can clearly see the form of the outer enclosure that's been ploughed down quite a way. To the south, it appears to peter out entirely, and it may have been unfinished. The inner enclosure is small but well defined, and there's even suggestion it may have originally been a Neolithic causewayed enclosure. There was a trial excavation in 1994, ostensibly to investigate the Neolithic connection. The results don't appear to have been published, leaving us with not a lot to work with. It's something I've been struggling with for this series. I want to share more details about sites, but particularly as we've headed into the West Country, there appears to be less and less detailed information available for many of the sites. A lot of them have no archaeology performed at all. So not to bury the lead, what this really means is there's an absence of an overarching narrative for the sites we're seeing. I don't have this detailed who, what and where tale to unpack for you as we would if this were the Romans or another ancient culture that had writing. And it shouldn't need to be said, but this is categorically not from a lack of effort or interest on my part. Few places fire the imagination quite like Cornwall, particularly its role in the ancient world. In fact, Cornwall may have been one of the best connected points to the wider world of the entire British Isles. Yes, we're going to be discussing some Bronze Age connections and tin mining and all of that across these 2 episodes, but this is prehistory. We're not dealing with an account of events or anything written about people or groups or anything that specific. Rather, we have to look at trends. And in that comparative lack of archaeology, the most honest thing we can often say about a place is, okay, here's the site, this is what we can tell you from surveys, and that might be about it. There's a couple of slender threads of evidence that we can examine, which we'll attend to in a bit. Interestingly, travelling on an east-west axis in this part of the world is comparatively slow going, even in modern times with a car. In this part of Cornwall, a series of deep valleys with rivers at their base flow north to south, meaning roads generally also run north to south, and crossings become fewer or disappear entirely as you approach the southern coast. So not especially far away as the crow flies, though a bit of a fiddly drive in practice, Castle Dore. Now, while at a glance this looks to be a fairly straightforward bivalate site, it in fact falls under the category of a multi-enclosure site. It has these two roughly concentric ramparts and a third rampart which is not really visible but expands the footprint of the site by quite a bit. And finally, we have a site that's had significant archaeology done. There was a dig undertaken in 1936 to 37. It revealed not only roundhouses and structures with either 4 or 6 posts, but also a sequence to the site which was likely built between the 4 to 300s BC based on ceramic finds, then was abandoned for a period before reoccupation in the 3 to 200s where the gate was remodelled. While there were traces of what may have been later Roman buildings, the pottery suggests that the site had been abandoned by then. Put a pin in the Roman presence. It's not that they're not here, but the fact they're only barely here in Cornwall is a head-scratcher. They appear to be operating with a light touch that we rarely see anywhere else in Britain. Well, we saw these two places 3.5 years apart, so I hadn't realised they were comparatively close. It's a bit of a hard cut from a beautiful sunny February day to a rather gloomy October, where the landscape was doing a passable impression of January. But this is Blackhead Promontory Fort, just on a piece of coastline protruding to the south of St Austell. And now we're in Cornwall, we're going to be catching a lot more promontory forts. Hey, you know what? We've got this far and not thrown to titles yet. So, title drop. So, Blackhead Promontory Fort, certainly not lacking spectacular and beautiful coastline here. Hillfort Atlas suggests there may have been significant erosion, so the rather narrow ingress to the promontory may have previously been much wider, with the suggestion that the original entrance may have been in this now missing western part. There are apparently other ramparts which I admit I'm struggling to perceive apart from these here and the traces of field systems and even a roundhouse in the interior, none of which is helped by a rifle range from the 1800s, so if you feel like you spy something, it may be from that and its subsequent use. I passed some people on the way back up who said they saw a shoal of tuna down there. At least I think that's what they said. When I got there, I had a look, but unless I'm massively missing something, I couldn't see any fish, but certainly a rewarding bit of coast. Now, I know this order might seem a little haphazard, but we're covering a large number of sites over a pretty massive area, all taken at wildly different times. So we're now switching from the southern coast to the north. And I'd kind of forgotten about this one for a while, which is faintly ridiculous considering how impressive it is. It's February again, and this was a pretty blowy day, if I recall. Trying to get aerial footage, but, struggling to get wide enough. Well, Warbstow Bury is, well, look at it. It's pretty impressive. I'll be honest, I remember the gap between the ramparts being a bit larger, but this is designated as another multi-enclosure hill fort, which, by the way, has been an ongoing discussion in the last couple of episodes. I mean, flick to the last if you're not caught up. So at least by appearance, it doesn't look all that different from the multi-valate forts we've seen up to this point in the series. But yes, when you actually walk through, you can see there's a good amount of space here to potentially graze flocks, for example. What confuses the picture somewhat, there's this middle rampart, which is somewhat visible on our footage, but particularly on plans, you can see that it's clearly unfinished. It actually bears quite striking resemblance to the unfinished Ladle Hill, famous for, being unfinished. And you can see the ditches are being dug in sections there you go. I had a theory on this, but there's a pretty good survey report, and it turns out I was wrong. This unfinished section was actually the earliest phase, and with the outer rampart being cut around it later, and the inner rampart being the last to be added. And it seems that this inner one overlays part of the course of the earliest rampart, at least on the eastern side. So while there's no recorded archaeology at Warbstow, we at least have an idea of the sequence in which the site evolved. But how's this for a bait and switch? So in the middle is something called a pillow mound. I can't lie, I'd not come across that term before, but I come across archaeological terms that I don't understand all the time, so no drama. And it's called Giant's Grave. Oh, guys, you're making this too easy. It's clearly going to be a Neolithic long barrow, just like, Bratton Camp or Hambledon. In fact, we have a bunch of long barrows in the UK called Giant's Grave. That's too easy. Well, apparently, no. This is a medieval rabbit warren. That's a place to breed rabbits. I'm not even mad. That's just funny. Like, something that mundane would get such a grand mythology built up around it. So that's Warbstow Bury. The survey admits that, yes, this is one of the most impressive and well-preserved hill forts in Cornwall, which makes the lack of archaeological work done even more puzzling. Well, to the south of here is Bodmin Moor, which would deserve much more discussion in a video on the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Yes, we discussed this dynamic last episode with Dartmoor. While not quite as stark in this area, you have another upland zone that was largely transformed by an increase in rainfall in the latter part of the British Bronze Age, and thus its Bronze Age settlements were abandoned. Still in quite incredible condition to visit today, but subsequent Iron Age settlement in this very hard to cultivate landscape was minimal. One day we will have a Bronze Age series where we explore barrow cemeteries across the landscape, as well as some of the finds, then places like the moors here in the West Country where settlement patterns have survived amazingly well in stone, as well as the wetter parts of the country that would have had pile-dwelling settlements a bit like the ones we see across the Alps. And in the other direction, a look at the Roman sites across Britain. We've been catching a lot more of those this year, whether it's the abandoned town of Venta Icenorum just south of Norwich, or the Antonine Wall and the surviving bathhouses around the Glasgow area, or the fort of Saguntium in Cunliffe in northern Wales, and then eventually loop down into France and across Spain and way to the other side of the Mediterranean. It's all stuff we have sitting on hard drives, but as you might imagine, there's a lot more to catch, and it's a massive amount of work to not only get to all these places ourselves, but also to cut these episodes together and ensure they're well researched and properly sourced. So please drop us a like and a subscribe to help us along. The way the meta is right now, for you to actually see our stuff, it's time to bring out our favourite visual metaphor. Yes, you're going to need to smash that bell. But no, seriously, the platform barely even bothers to put our stuff in front of people who have clicked subscribe. It's wildly counterintuitive, so to actually see our stuff, you're probably going to need to have notifications on. Okay, but moving along, next, a couple that are a little bit more tree-covered. Helsbury Castle is a univalent hill fort. It doesn't have an original entrance visible, but it may have been to the east. Your eyes can't help but be drawn to that feature in the centre. This is the remains of a chapel. Now, while most of the hill fort hasn't had any archaeology done, a Reverend Gibbons in the 1800s did attempt to excavate the chapel. However, he didn't find any datable material, so apart from a dedication to St. Sith, the chapel also remains a bit of a mystery. Then a short way to the west, from above, the mixture of trees and scrub do a modest job of masking the ramparts of Trevelgue rounds, but you can see from the LiDAR they survive in fair condition. It's another multi-enclosure form, and you can see the fair gap between the banks. Now, this actually did have a small dig done in 1902 by Reverend S. Baring Gould. Now, interestingly, he claimed to have found traces of occupation between the ramparts with slingstones, perforated stones, spindle halls, and Iron Age pottery, and interpreted that occupation was in the outer enclosure, with the inner enclosure likely used as an animal pound. Now, that runs contrary to other sites where it was interpreted the habitation was in the most central enclosure with livestock in the outer areas. Now, it's entirely possible that both are true, that either was tried at different sites. I can't say how their methods on the 1902 dig compare to our standards today. I mean, we are far more rigorous with digs now, but look, pinch of salt. I mean, I've not done a dig myself, and hey, in an area where few archaeological investigations have been done, it's nice to have something to work with. But just a remark, if anyone is noticing, there's a morphology that we're seeing somewhat commonly here. If you're in Wiltshire or Hampshire, around there, univalent hill forts that look roughly like this were the norm. Or if you were to develop the hill fort into a bivalate or multivalate site, you generally stack the ramparts directly abutting the previous ones. Well, here in Cornwall, we have this pattern that trends more towards a multi-enclosure form. You have the central enclosure, maybe a bit of a gap, and then a second outer enclosure. If we go down what we've seen so far, we've got Bury Down, Castle Dore, Warbstow, Ralegh, and then even Castle and Dinas, which is coming up. And you start to see it. I suggested that in the absence of writing and then the added lack of excavations, dating evidence is thin on the ground, so we're unusually short of threads to pull on to characterise the people or peoples living in the Cornish Iron Age. Often the best thing we can do is compare the morphology of sites, that's the sort of form and overall shape. Look for patterns, and then if there are places where archaeology has been undertaken, use those as something of a baseline and make comparisons. That's not a bug, that's just a feature of researching these sites, and this similarity in design is at least something of a unique thumbprint for people here. That, and another type of site that marks out this part of the world. This was early morning just on the coastline above the town of Polzeath, and this beautiful promontory fort is the Rumps. No, really, one of the finest promontory forts in the country along this gorgeous piece of Cornish coast, and we're going with the Rumps. Okay. But yeah, this one is pretty special. The first time we saw this was on a windy, stormy day about 4 years ago, and we couldn't get airborne. But this autumn we made it back, and while the sunrise turned out to be a bit nothing, we did at least get a much better look at it. And as well as the multivallate ditches being unusually prominent, there was a dig here between 1963 to 67. Now, first of all, while you can't make it out from the surface, the interior was quite densely settled. We don't always just assume that enclosures are occupied, and especially promontory forts, there's always the possibility of other uses such as seasonal encampment or ceremonial space. Well, at the Rumps, there seems little doubt of major occupation. The chronology of the dig revealed was 3 construction phases and 2 habitation phases. It's somewhat late compared to the phases of early, mid and late we're used to, kind of further east. The earliest feature of the site appears to be a V-shaped ditch behind the outermost rampart, but dating for this was not determined conclusively. The first settlement appears contemporary with the inner rampart, around the 100s BC, and then with a large timber gate. There was a second rampart built outside the first, and then the site appears to go out of use somewhere in the mid-1st century AD, so about the time the Romans are entering Britain. It's also believed that the site enjoyed good trade links to the Mediterranean based on amphora finds. As Barry Cunliffe is keen to point out, our modern perspective on Britain tends to approximate something like, right, well, how long does it take to drive here from London, say? In which case, places in rural Devon and Cornwall seem peripheral, distant places, and the implication being that therefore they are of low importance. But in ancient times, these places were linked by sea to wide trade networks and actually may have been some of the most cosmopolitan places you'd find anywhere. We're going to explore Cornwall's links to the wider world more next episode, though if it feels like there's a conspicuous gap in our discussion of coastal sites, this is Tintagel, which may be one of the most important ancient sites in Cornwall, and refreshingly, other than its mythological associations, it has some of the most important archaeology in the West Country to match. Now, surviving stone-built architecture from shortly after the departure of the Romans in England, I mean, on the surface at least, those are about as common as Neolithic airports. Actually, no, there'll be a crowd of Facebook shut-ins who think that's real. Bad example. Anyway, this is excitingly rare stuff. However, you can see that for a site which would have had this much significance at the tail end and immediately after the Roman period in Britain, it makes sense that it would have had previous occupation, especially just looking at its shape. I mean, it could scarcely be more perfect, at least, before the gap here had fully collapsed. But as it stands, we do not yet have anything in the archaeology to explicitly tie the site with Iron Age occupation. I mean, in some ways, join the club. There's plenty of promontory forts that are lacking archaeological traces, if any archaeology has been undertaken. I'm going to be tapping the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence sign particularly hard. But yes, other than conjecture about the ditches of a promontory fort that might have gone somewhere between this medieval folly and the yawning chasm, we don't yet have anything to tie this to the Iron Age. So it's a great story to be told, but for another time. But speaking of promontory forts and the lack of archaeological traces, this is the Wine Cove complex. I realised I've been typing this out like it was like Winnikov or something, but no, Wine Cove. Now, to look at, well, visit Cornwall, I guess. Yeah, a lovely part of coastline with a puzzling pattern of headlands surviving, but with deep notches being carved in between. Now, I have previously and will once more profess minimal geological experience, so I cannot interrogate how this particular pattern would occur over a 2,000 plus year time span. But this is where we have our puzzle. You see, these ditches are very closely aligned. I normally have no time for people just squinting at photos and then making broad archaeological assertions. I mean, goodness knows how many bad takes from, it's Facebook. It's usually Facebook have come based on like, yeah, it looks like it to me. What, you want to fight about it? But those ditches really do look like they were cut as one line, not two separate. They are just a little too perfect. And elsewhere, it's not unheard of to see what you'd assume to be the most prominent part of the headland being eroded away behind the ditches in roughly this pattern. So, yeah, it's possible that this was once one connected site. And it's Dave from the future here, while in the edit, going back through my footage and notes as I'm cutting this together. On the day, I hadn't so much clocked this third promontory here, which, yes, is also pretty much doing its own thing. Hillfort Atlas presents both sides that while it's possible this is one site with erosion down the middle, it is also possible that these were separate promontory sites to begin with. It's a puzzle either way. It's hard to see why you'd make these little promontory sites ostensibly without occupation, but that is almost certainly the wrong question, because one site or three, pretty much zero chance the coastline wasn't significantly different. So yeah, it's hard to say definitively, and that is practically our default position in prehistory. It's a lot of questions, like a lot, and not many answers. If there's a backstory to all of this, making it to North Cornwall for a glorious sundown at an incredible hostel, and it's all part of a who am I, what am I doing, mental health, redemption arc, some mix of all of those things. But it'll be an episode sometime, we'll get to it. We've made good progress through a lot of sites this time, but we've got a couple more to see, and not far away from Wine Cove, it's another of Cornwall's most significant. Castle and Dinas. Just look at that. Now, like the Rumps, 2 attempts later, and I still haven't caught this on a sunny day, but no matter. Now, this may well be one of the finest of its type in Cornwall. I had mentally noted this down as another sort of somewhat multi-enclosure site, but if you look a bit closer, well, okay, you tell me, how many ramparts do you see? Well, if you answered 2, then, fair enough. A diagram of it shows 4, and this is where you'll see the similarity to Warbstow. The earliest rampart is quite slight, and it's in this area, which may have been used for pasture in later phases. There were excavations in the 1960s, and again, I'm grateful to have some work done, but despite a report on the first season's findings being published, details on subsequent seasons are spotty. There's another solid survey report on this, which was a really good read. The excavations were on quite a small area, but they excavated each rampart, and other than all being dump construction, they determined that Rampart 3, which is the one that's quite slight now, is the earliest layer. And then the other ramparts were added later, with Rampart 2, for example, starting off as something of a counterscarp for Rampart 1. This is something that makes our job harder, the fine line between a separate bank and just a counterscarp, but I feel we're veering away from relatability again. It's actually remarkable that the Hillfort survives as it does, as there was a massive mine on the hillside in the early 20th century. But Castle and Dinas, which, yes, is a tautology, one of the best examples in the county. And this next one, just outside of Bodmin, is pretty massive. In fact, it's one of Cornwall's largest. It's a multi-valet enclosure, although if you look at the LiDAR, the inner rampart is mostly buried. The multiple ditches are best seen on the southern side. I'm not 100% who was burning what in the field adjacent, but I didn't attempt to investigate further in case they thought I was the cops. When you're there, it's harder to get a sense of this, as you've just come off a main road and we're on the edge of the town of Bodmin. But before this was encroached by field systems in the 1800s, this was moorland. And you get up a little, you can see its clear vantage over the countryside. Also, it was this encroachment of field systems that divided the site into quarters, and there's a later water tank in the middle. Otherwise, it's been surveyed various times, and a geophys in the 80s revealed some settlement features as well as the buried ramparts. But anyway, now we're heading south and to the coast, and we get to Trevelgue Head. I'm expecting to be absolutely ratioed in the comments below on my pronunciation of Cornish sites, so yeah, knock yourselves out. But okay, quick backstory. I was conscious that for all the footage I had for these sites, I really didn't have the Cornish Iron Age figured out yet. The sort of lack of connecting threads was proving difficult, so I asked Toby Driver, who is much smarter, infinitely more qualified, and on top of things than me, for book recommendations, and he suggested this absolute slab of a book which landed on my mat with an audible crash. Now, I've already complained that Cornish sites often lack archaeological investigation, and now here's this breeze block sized book about one excavation in 1939. Okay, I think we're in danger of falling off the horse the other way, because to fill that number of pages, we're talking about some very detailed examinations of specific pottery finds. I almost wish I hadn't brought this up, because I don't have time to devour this book cover to cover and synthesize a summary of everything in it. So, well, first off, this has 8 ramparts. 8, in fact possibly 9 depending how you slice it, but the chasm that severs it from the land also somewhat distracts. This is a mixture of coastal erosion, it was also mined for stone. The 8 don't all just rack up one after the other, and some are scarcely visible. So the 1939 excavation by Croft Andrew, which is one of the largest of its kind seen in Cornwall, gives us one of the most detailed chronologies we have for any Cornish site, and it was a long-lived one, beginning with some Mesolithic occupation. There's 2 Bronze Age barrows on the site, and for anyone following the series so far, stop me if this sounds familiar. We have some activity on the site from the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, a main phase of occupation between about 400 to 100 BC, then activity may have reduced in the Late Iron Age. It may have been abandoned entirely. We have a lack of material on the site datable to then, and similarly, based on coin finds, we know there's Roman activity there, but likely not as a major settlement in the same way it had been in the Mid-Iron Age. There were 2 roundhouses excavated, but there were many more in the site's busiest Mid-Iron Age phase, and there's also evidence of metalwork taking place there. Really, it's kind of got it all. So those are the main beats, while there is clearly a lot more that we could say of the site. Without me taking a month to pour through this twice, and also my footage was taken on a windy day where we didn't have a lot of time to stop. This is a fair summary of one of Cornwall's largest coastal fort settlements, but we should say that Trevelgue is an unusually significant promontory fort in Cornwall, and that what is true for it may not necessarily be true for all others. For example, that Trevelgue had a significant number of hut platforms does not in turn mean that all promontory forts were inhabited in the same way. Of course, yes, absence of evidence, not necessarily evidence of absence, but in the absence of archaeological evidence at other sites, we need to resist the temptation to paint them all with the same brush. Well, just one more for this week, which gets us a little way further south, and amusingly, while I knew there were the remains of a promontory fort here, I wasn't sure in what condition. And while I could see I was close to the sea, I then saw this very slight rise, like scarcely more than about 12 inches from the ground. So began filming like, oh, yikes, this is going to be very hard to show clearly on camera, but just to quickly check my working, I proceeded just a few yards further, only to discover, oh, right, yeah, okay, that makes more sense. I feel like Crane Castle might have taken that a bit personally, like, come on, dude, I've taken some damage, but I'm not that slight. So yes, here are the pretty clear and well-preserved ditches of Crane Castle. Only thing, though, what are we enclosing here exactly? Yeah, safe to say that the headland that was once Crane Castle has since collapsed down into the sea, and there's no shortage of debris and rock below. There have been plenty of lithic finds just on the surface in the surrounding area. There was a geophys done in the area just behind here, which revealed medieval farm systems, but also pretty heavy ploughing. So if that seems like a bit of an anticlimax, I'm sorry, but of course this is not the end, this is just the halfway point. We're continuing next episode, and as we get further west, this is where some of the major structures that we've been teasing start to emerge. You see, this is called a fugu. It's a subterranean passage. It's 2,000 plus years old. Its use is a great mystery, and there's a bunch of them at the far end of Cornwall. Also, these are courtyard settlements. It's an Iron Age community whose buildings have pretty much survived in place, and yet it's also a really singular form of architecture in Britain. And there's still a bunch more hill forts and some promontory forts too. It's a lot. So yes, hit the bell so that doesn't pass you by. Oh, and just briefly, while we're mentioning Toby Driver, very excited because recently we got to have a sit down and a chat about the Iron Age in Wales and Welsh hill forts and everything around that. And we're going to be putting that up pretty soon, but I was absolutely serious about his book, a more easy to read and comprehensive guide of both the Welsh Iron Age and just hill forts in general you could scarcely find. Like, if you're a hill fort enthusiast, you probably have this on your shelf already, but if you haven't, you know, it's coming up to Christmas, I'd say get this for a friend or relative, but probably just get it for yourself. But it's a really good read and a massive recommend. And meanwhile, if you've enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it all on bandcamp.com. That's kind of what we have instead of a Patreon, and if you want to support us in the most tangible way, that's the place to do it. Also, you can catch us on Blue Sky for much more regular updates. You know, it takes us something between like 20 to 30 hours to put out just one of these, but on Blue Sky we can kind of show you what we're doing on a more week-to-week. Otherwise, we'll see you again very soon.